Hello everyone, and welcome to our last lecture of Unit 3. So this lecture is going to talk about vaccines and vaccination. And we started talking about this topic just a little bit in our last lecture on adaptive immunity as one of the ways that we can have someone develop artificial active immunity. And remember, with artificial active immunity, we are using some kind of medical procedure or medical technique to introduce antigens into the person's body so that they will respond by producing antibodies, which will give them, hopefully at least, some long-term immunity. The basic principle behind vaccination is that we are exposing someone to the antigenic part of the microbe, but not the pathogenic part. So when we create vaccines, what we do is we look at the microbe and we say, okay, these parts up here on the surface, those are the antigens. Those are the things that our body responds to by producing antibodies. And so those are the parts that we need to put in the vaccine to help that person create the antibodies. However, what we don't want to do in that process is give them enough of the microbe or give them the microbe in a certain form that would make them sick. So the whole goal of vaccination is to expose someone to just enough of the antigens so that they will produce antibodies, but not enough of the microbe so that they will get sick. The idea being that when they are exposed to the antigens, their body will respond, produce antibodies, and then, like I said, hopefully for a long time after that vaccine, they will have IgG that circulates throughout their body and helps protect them the next time, or maybe even the first time, they're actually exposed to that microbe in real life. Now, the history of vaccination is actually quite long. Although the vaccinations that we use these days were created in kind of the early to mid 1900s, at least initially, the idea behind vaccination has been around for many years. There is evidence that in very ancient times, people in places like China, Africa, and Turkey had figured out if they expose people to very small amounts of the smallpox virus, they can help protect that person from a big case of the disease later. Now, what they would do, and I couldn't find a picture of it that I can put in here, but you can kind of imagine it as I'm describing it, is they would take a scab from a person that had smallpox. This is not a smallpox scab, but it's very close to it. So roughly, this is what you should be imagining. So what they would do is take this scab from a person and they would grind it up into a very, very fine powder. And then they would put it onto something that looks a lot like the inoculating loop that you use in lab. And they would blow through that so that very fine particles of that scab would get into a person's nose. This would expose them to the virus. Hopefully, they would not be exposed to enough of the virus that they would get very sick, but hopefully they would develop a mild illness. By developing this mild illness, that would protect them later on when major smallpox outbreaks would occur and hopefully prevent them from dying from the disease. So this idea that we can give someone a little bit of a microbe to help protect them in the long run is not something that's new. This is something that people in ancient civilizations had figured out, even if they didn't know exactly how it was working. In the late 1700s, there was a scientist named Edward Jenner who really started making some progress on vaccination as a whole, at least vaccination as we know it. And what he noticed was that people who got a disease called cowpox, and you actually are looking at cowpox here, tended to not get smallpox when there were major outbreaks of that. So most of these people were what they call milkmaids. They were young women who milked cows, and cows get a disease called cowpox. This virus is very similar to the virus that causes smallpox in humans. It's not identical, but it shares some of the same antigens. So people who got cowpox from milking the cows, from being exposed to the virus that way, tended to get this outbreak on their hands. It would kind of run up their arm, maybe to their elbows, maybe a little bit past, but it never really got into the rest of the body or caused a lot of damage in the body. And what he noticed was that these mostly young women who got cowpox almost never developed smallpox later. So he figured out that if he took a little bit of the cowpox virus from the person's body, again, pretty much from taking a scab or taking some samples from one of the lesions, and he injected that into someone else's body, that person would then be protected from smallpox. So we have a picture down here of a bunch of people in somewhere in Europe, probably in England somewhere, could be in France somewhere because it was prevalent there as well. But they were lining up to get the smallpox vaccine back in the 1700s. And because of this vaccine, we were actually able to eradicate smallpox, which means completely wipe it out. It doesn't exist anymore, except in laboratory settings, from the face of the earth. Now, vaccination, unfortunately, cannot do that for every disease, because the thing that's unique about smallpox is that it only exists in humans. It doesn't exist in any animal reservoirs or any animal hosts. So we were able to, through a lot of vaccination campaigns, completely get rid of smallpox out in the environment because the only hosts for that virus are humans. Now, continuing our story of vaccination, after Edward Jenner did his work with the smallpox vaccine, and that kind of took off in Europe and then spread through the rest of the world, about 100 years later, Pasteur was able to develop the rabies vaccine, which was really significant at that time. We don't tend to see a lot of rabies cases, especially in the United States, because most of our animals, whether they are domesticated or something like livestock, will have some kind of rabies vaccination. So that was a really big thing to be developed at that time period. And then based off the work of these two men and some others that were going on at the time, kind of the late 1800s with Pasteur, the vaccinations that we consider to be part of just our normal childhood series of vaccinations started to be developed. Those vaccines were things against measles, mumps, and rubella, diphtheria, and whooping cough, to name a few. And the reason those were some of the first vaccines focused on were that things like measles, diphtheria, and whooping cough were very, very serious in children at that time, and they still would be serious in children at this time if they didn't get their vaccinations. And so there was a really big effort to kind of help children survive childhood, basically. Before vaccination, we lost a lot of children before their 5th birthday to various diseases. And so there was a lot of work put into developing these vaccines against the diseases that killed many children before their 5th birthday. Now, these days, the vaccines that we use on a regular basis fall into 5 main categories. Last semester, this lecture just mentioned 4 main categories, but now we have a 5th category of type of vaccination. So our first type of vaccine is what we call the killed whole microbe. With a killed whole microbe, what we do is we take an entire microbe, an entire virus, or an entire bacterium, and we kill it using something like heat or chemicals. What that does is preserve the antigen. So let's just say this is our antigen up here. So it keeps the antigen intact, but it kills off the pathogen so that that bacterium or virus cannot cause disease when it's put in our body. We then take those killed whole microbes, put them into a vaccine, inject that into a person's body, or sometimes spray it up their nose, depending on what delivery system we are using. And the person is able to respond to those antigens without getting sick from the microbe because it's dead and it can't replicate in the person's body. And then they produce the antibodies they need to do things like opsonization, neutralization, complement, fixation, etc., when they come in contact with that microbe in a real life setting. So examples of types of vaccines that use this technique are the vaccine for hepatitis A, inactivated polio, and what we call whole cell pertussis. And we're actually going to talk about all of these diseases in our next unit, so you'll learn a little bit about those. Our next main type of vaccine is the live attenuated vaccine. With this vaccine, we actually use a live microbe, which means that it's still alive, but we weaken it to the point that it's not going to be able to replicate in the human body. We oftentimes can do that with heat, with chemicals, or just through a process of growing this type of microbe in non-human cells so that the microbe gets very good at replicating in something like a yeast cell or a chicken cell, but not at all good at replicating in a human cell. What that means is that the person is able to respond to the antigens. We'll just call these the antigens on this little microbe here. The virus is not able, or the bacterium, is not able to make the person sick because it can't replicate in their body very well. And then they will have antibodies to the antigens so that when they come in contact with this microbe in a real life setting, they will have the antibodies to protect them. Examples of those are MMR, which is measles, mumps, and rubella, rotavirus, and chickenpox. Again, all diseases we will learn about in our next unit. Our third main type of vaccine is the subunit vaccine. With a subunit vaccine, what we are able to do is grow the microbe in a lab and then kind of take it apart so we only need to use the antigens in the vaccine. In a subunit vaccine, we don't even have a whole microbe in there. We just have pieces of the microbe. So what we do is we take those pieces of the microbe, we put them into a vaccine, we give that to the person, they respond to these antigens, make their antibodies, and then they are protected from that whole microbe when they get exposed to it in a real life setting. Examples are hepatitis B, acellular pertussis, and then not listed here, but oftentimes the influenza vaccine is created this way as well. Our fourth type of vaccine is the toxoid vaccine. A toxoid vaccine is based just off a toxin that a microbe may produce. There are some situations where a microbe is not particularly dangerous to us, but the toxin it produces can be very serious in terms of causing illness or even death. And so for us, the important thing to vaccinate against is not the bacterium or the virus, but the toxin that can be produced. So what we do to make these is we grow the microbe in a lab, and most of the time this is a bacteria, so I'm just going to say bacteria here. So we grow the bacteria in a lab, and we force it to produce its toxin. We take that toxin and separate it from the bacterium, and then we modify that toxin in some kind of way. Again, usually using something like heat or some kind of chemical that will change its shape. And this will create what's called a toxoid. A toxoid is basically just an inactivated toxin. We then will use that toxoid in the vaccine, put that into the person's body, and they will make antibodies to this toxoid. Those antibodies, though, will be good enough, they will be the right shape, so that if a person gets exposed to this bacterium in real life and the bacterium starts to make the toxin, we or that person will have the antibodies that will bind to that toxin, go through the process of usually something like precipitation, inactivate that toxin, and make it so we don't get sick. The two common vaccines that are used or that are made this way, used with this technology, are the vaccines for tetanus and diphtheria. And then our last category of vaccination is the mRNA vaccine. With mRNA vaccines, what we do is we find the sequence of mRNA that codes for the antigen. So basically what we do is we look at the DNA of the organism, we figure out which gene in that organism creates the antigen. We can copy that DNA and then create mRNA based off of that. That mRNA sequence will then be put into what we call a lipid nanoparticle, and that is there just to prevent the mRNA from falling apart, because mRNA overall actually isn't super stable. It falls apart very quickly. So we coat it with this just little layer of lipids to help protect it from immediate degradation. Then the mRNA goes into the person's cells, and that mRNA is used to make the protein, which is the antigen. So that person makes some of the antigens to the microbe. Their body recognizes that antigen as something that is foreign, responds to it, and creates antibodies so that when they come in contact with this microbe in a real life setting, they are able to respond to it because they have the antibodies. Currently, the only vaccine that is being made that way is the COVID vaccine. However, there is a decent chance that in the future we will be able to use this type of vaccine for lots of different types of diseases. And one of the real benefits about this type of technology is it allows us to have a rapid response to real life situations. A lot of people have been worried that this was rushed, but remember there's a difference between rushed and rapid. Using mRNA technology is very, very beneficial because we can develop vaccines very quickly and modify those vaccines very quickly as well to keep up with the evolution of microbes. When we talk about things like live attenuated, the toxoid vaccines, even the subunit vaccines, those ones take a lot longer to be able to develop initially and be able to modify as the virus evolves or the bacterium evolves, although viruses tend to evolve a bit more quickly in these types of situations. But the mRNA vaccines allow us to keep up with the evolution of the microbe basically in real time. We're not having to wait and go back to the lab quite as often or take as much time to be able to catch up to the virus. So I know this is a technology that has worried a lot of people. However, the results have indicated that it's a very effective way to create vaccines. Literally billions of doses have been given to people around the world with these types of vaccines, and they have been proven to be safe and effective so far. And so it's quite likely that mRNA vaccines will join the other types of vaccination procedures or types of vaccines, however you want to look at that, in the coming years. Although our current vaccines are safe, effective, and they have done wonders in terms of preventing a lot of illness and a lot of death in the world, there's almost always a way that we can do things better. So vaccination research is still ongoing, and there are lots of efforts to look at ways to improve vaccines. So as good as they are right now, we can still probably do better. And so there are different techniques under review to see if they could be effective at increasing vaccine efficacy and making things better than they are now. Now, the ones I have listed here may not end up coming to fruition, meaning they may not end up being ones that we end up using, but they are fairly promising right now. So one thing that we may see in the future is a patch delivery vaccine system. Instead of using something like needles or sprays that go up the nose, or sometimes, at least in the old days, they would put the polio vaccine on sugar cubes. They might still do that in certain areas, but not in the US really. But we may be able to develop patches that look kind of like those little circle band-aids that you can put on just a very tiny cut if you have one on your body. But basically these patches have micro needles on them. So if we have like a little patch that looks like this, and then it has a bunch of little needles on it, the number would be determined by various factors. And each one of those needles is going to have its own dose of antigen on it. So whatever disease or diseases we are trying to vaccinate against with that patch, the antigens will be placed on the surface of those little tiny needles. That patch will be put onto the skin, and then that person will be able to respond to the antigens, make their antibodies, and this will save a lot of space because they're a lot smaller than things like syringes. They will probably be cheaper to manufacture, and they will hopefully at least be just as effective in terms of vaccinating people against the diseases they need to be protected against. We may also see gender-specific vaccines. There has been a lot of research that's come out recently that has shown that women tend to be better at responding to vaccines than men are. And what that means is this isn't a competition. It just means that women's bodies typically need exposure to fewer antigens to be able to produce protective levels of antibodies than men. So let's say a woman needs to be exposed to 100 pieces of the antigen, and she will be able to protect herself against the microbe. She'll make enough antibodies for it. A man might need 150 or 250 pieces of the antigen to produce a protective response. So what we're finding is that women typically need to be exposed to fewer antigens to get the protection they need, and that men need to be exposed to a little bit more than that to get the protection they need. This will allow us to create vaccines that can be given to people based off of their gender, and that will hopefully allow them to just be more cost effective and create fewer of the side effects of things like being tired or having a sore arm and stuff like that. And then we also will hopefully see an increase in the number of diseases that we can vaccinate for. A lot of people are very insistent these days that we already vaccinate for too many diseases, but that is oftentimes a very privileged viewpoint to take when you live in the United States or you live in Western Europe and there isn't a lot of disease around you, in large part because of the vaccines you've had. It can be easy to look at the world and say, well, look, people really just don't get sick anymore. We don't need to do this. These diseases aren't that bad. We don't need to protect people. But when you live in a place in the world where children under 5 are dying on a daily basis because they're getting sick from things that we could potentially protect them from, your viewpoint probably shifts and will say, we don't protect people enough from certain types of diseases. So ideally, we will be able to protect people from many more types of diseases in the future, and we can target those to different areas of the world where certain types of microbes are present, even if they aren't present in another location. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of vaccines in general, before we get into some of the common misconceptions about vaccines, is the vaccination schedule. So the vaccination schedule is something that you can look up on things like the World Health Organization, the CDC website. Most pediatricians' offices will give you a copy of that. But basically, the vaccination schedule is the schedule that we use to determine when to give vaccines to children. And then there are actually vaccine schedules for adolescents and adults as well, although they don't get quite as much attention. The vaccination schedule is another thing that can oftentimes be very concerning for people because they think we are exposing kids to these vaccines too soon in their life and that we should be spacing these out more and not using the schedule that is set the way it is. But I like to at least give you the information about why the schedule is set the way it is, and then you can make your decisions based on that information. The timing of the vaccines we give to children is based on a few different things. One, it's based on the developmental stage of the child and the likelihood that they are exposed to a certain type of disease and would develop that disease. it's also based on the severity of the disease. So, with certain vaccines, we are going to want to give them a little bit earlier so that the child is protected because they're more likely to be exposed to that type of microbe at a certain stage of their life. Or if they are exposed to it, even if it isn't a high likelihood that they would be exposed, if they are exposed to it, they could get very, very sick or die. So we give those vaccines maybe a little bit earlier and then wait on ones a little bit later in certain cases. Another big thing about when we give the vaccines is how ready their immune system is. And when I say that, mostly what I'm talking about is the immune system going to be ready to respond effectively and make protective levels of antibodies? Typically, if you were to give a vaccine too early to a child, probably nothing would happen. In most cases, it wouldn't be a big problem most of the time. However, what is likely to happen is that as their immune system is developing, if you give them an antigen that they're not ready to respond to, basically their body will just ignore it and not make antibodies. So when we give vaccines at certain times in a child's life, it's because we have done a ton of research and realized, okay, at 6 months, the child's body is able to recognize this at foreign and actually make protective antibodies. But if we give it earlier in that, a lot of times the child's body will just kind of ignore it and then not make the antibodies. So they're given at certain times to make sure the body responds appropriately and makes enough antibodies to protect them. And then finally, one of the big things that is taken into consideration when we are talking about giving vaccines to especially young children is decreasing maternal immunity. So babies are born having about 6 months protection from their mother to all or at least most of the diseases that she has been exposed to in her life. However, by about month 6, all of that protection from the mother is gone. Now, if the infant is being breastfed, they will get some antibodies to current infections that the mother might have been exposed to, but they won't necessarily have those protections to things like measles or mumps or diphtheria or polio because the mother probably hasn't been currently exposed to those. So for all of the diseases the mother has been exposed to, whether that's naturally or through vaccination, that protection will be given to the baby as well, but it only lasts about 6 months. So when you look at the vaccination schedule, you will see that at 6 months, we tend to pick up a little bit more and start to introduce more vaccines so that as the mother's immunity wears off and eventually completely disappears, the baby has had a chance to start producing their own. Now that we've gone over the basics about vaccines in terms of what they are, the history, the different types we have, why we have the schedule set the way we do, etc., I'd like to spend some time talking about vaccine misconceptions. Unfortunately, there is a lot of really bad information online these days about vaccines, and so I like to go over the most common misconceptions that are out there and why they really are misconceptions. Why it is that the things that sometimes are put out there aren't actually true, and help you understand what the reality is when you see these types of things posted on Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media account you are using. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about vaccines, and so we can't necessarily cover every single one of them. However, I've compiled some of the most common. I think these are like the 10 most common misconceptions about vaccines, and this is based on research. There is actually quite a bit of research into understanding why there's so much misinformation about vaccines and why so many people have a hard time understanding the truth about them versus the misconceptions that are put online. And when we look into why this area has become such a hotbed of misinformation, Most of it really boils down to a few things. One of them is lack of knowledge about how immunity works. Most people honestly don't know how the immune system works because most people don't go into the healthcare professions or go into biology or go into immunology or any of those types of things. So most people are not getting the information about the immune system that you all have gotten because they're not going into the fields that you intend to go into. There is also a lot of misconceptions based on the fact that people don't understand how the research and development process works. So one thing that's being said a lot right now is that, again, mRNA vaccines are rushed, they're not ready, etc. But the reality is mRNA vaccines have actually been kind of under construction for about 20 years now, if not a little bit longer. So these types of vaccines, although this is the first time we've used them, they've actually been working on them for a long time, and all of the technology that was used to create them, none of it is new. It's all been around for years, if not decades. But most people don't know that because it doesn't affect their daily lives, and that's fair. Oftentimes people often lack knowledge about the components. If you sometimes will see, this is a list of the things that are in vaccines, and they look like these horrible chemicals. And if you don't know about chemistry or don't know about biology, you look at those and you're like, wow, I can't even pronounce that. That sounds terrifying. And that's justifiable. If you don't have the background knowledge to understand that list of chemicals, you might want to, take a step back and say, whoa, that looks bad. But at the same time, it's important to understand that one, everything in the world is made up of chemicals, and two, all of the chemicals that we put into our bodies on a regular basis also have complex names. So when we look at the list of components of vaccines, those chemicals are very, very common ones that we find in stuff we put into our bodies on a regular basis anyway. It's just people don't know about that because it's, again, not something they necessarily need to know about. And then finally, another one of the major sources of misconceptions about vaccines is the lack of knowledge about disease. If you are born and raised in a developed nation and you have never experienced infectious illness the way other people in the world do, it's easy to look around and say, well, people don't really get sick. They get cold sometimes they get the flu, they might get like a stomach bug sometimes, but that's it. Why are we vaccinating against all these diseases that don't exist anymore? But the fact is the diseases that we vaccinate against do exist still. They exist in lots of places in the world, and the reason that we don't get them most of the time is because of the vaccines. So it's very easy to look around in a developed nation and say, people don't get measles anymore, people don't get diphtheria, people don't get polio. But the fact is, people do get these diseases, not very often in developed nations, but these are spread worldwide and they still kill people, especially children, worldwide every year. One of the first major misconceptions about vaccines is the idea that we can overload the immune system. The concern is that if we give too many vaccines, especially too close together, it will overload the immune system and it will stop functioning properly. However, there's actually been a lot of research on this idea. Literally, there have been thousands of studies that go over things like the schedule of vaccines, the types of vaccines and when they should be given, etc. And not a single one of them has ever actually shown that our current vaccination schedule does that. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is that the number of antigens in our vaccines continues to actually get smaller because our vaccines get better and better. So one of the things that we often hear is that our parents or grandparents got fewer vaccines and they didn't have problems, and we get more vaccines and do have problems. But one thing to understand about that is that back in the day when our parents and grandparents were getting vaccines, when they were kind of really first being introduced on a widespread scale or widespread use, the number of antigens that were in those vaccines far exceeded the number of antigens that we find in the vaccines today. So let's say your grandmother got 5 vaccinations. She got vaccinated against 5 diseases when she was a child. And you were vaccinated against 10. You probably were vaccinated as more than that, but we're just doing this for numbers purposes. So let's say your grandmother got 5 vaccines and you got 10 vaccines. Chances are actually very good that even with all of your 10 vaccines added together, you got fewer antigens than your grandmother got in the 5 vaccines she got. Because when we were first developing vaccines, we didn't have all the technology we have today, so we didn't know exactly which parts of the microbe we needed to include, etc. So our early vaccines, although they were effective and they were safe, they were somewhat crude in the sense that they were not refined the way they can be today. So they had to use more antigens and more microbes in those vaccines because they weren't able to really get down into understanding the antigen itself and how our body responds to it. And so they just had to use a lot of antigens to provoke the same type of protective response than we need to use today. So today we can still provoke a very effective response, but we need fewer antigens to do that because we know a lot more about the antigens and how to get our body to make antibodies than we did back then. And then another thing to think about is our bodies deal with literally thousands of different antigens a day. And thousands is a very conservative number. It's probably more like millions, but just being very conservative in my estimate, our bodies deal with thousands of antigens every day, right? If you eat an apple, if you eat celery, if you put your toothbrush in your mouth, if you wipe your eye with your finger, everything you have done has just introduced microbes into your body. If you get a cut, even if it's something so small you don't even realize, you get little tiny, micro cuts in your skin that introduces microbes into your body. Your body deals with literally thousands of microbes every single day. And so this thought that we can overload the immune system doesn't make a lot of sense when we start to understand exactly how many microbes we encounter every single day. So outlets definitely can be overloaded. Do not do something like this. This is a bad thing to do. But our immune systems are pretty tough things. And at least as the vaccination schedule is set today, we definitely don't overload them. We enhance them. Another very common misconception about vaccines and vaccination is that the diseases that we vaccinate against don't exist anymore, so we don't need to use the vaccines anymore. But the reality is those microbes that cause those diseases absolutely still exist. We may not notice that they're being passed through our communities because of the vaccines, but they definitely still exist. People do still get exposed to them. And if you just look at regions outside of the developed world, you will see people who are getting things like measles and polio and diphtheria and rubella. These diseases still exist, and when people don't vaccinate against them, we will start seeing an increase in them. The only disease we've ever been able to eradicate through vaccination is smallpox. So unless you're talking about smallpox, the diseases and the microbes that cause them absolutely still exist. And if we stop vaccinating, they will come back and we will start seeing people, especially children, getting sick. Another one of the most common misconceptions about vaccines is that they are ineffective. People look at vaccines and they say, well, people still get sick when they get vaccines, so there's no point in taking them. And when we look at this overarching misconception, we can kind of break it down into 2 smaller misconceptions or 2 smaller misunderstandings in another way of looking at it. So some people look at vaccines and they say, well, more people who are vaccinated than unvaccinated get sick anyway, so there's no point in taking the vaccine. And this is partially true when you look at things one way, but I want to give you a deeper understanding of this so that you can understand why this is not really the most logical way to look at these vaccines. So it can be true It's not always true, but it can be true in certain situations that if you have a given population and most of those people are vaccinated and you only have a few unvaccinated people, that if a disease goes through the community, more people who are vaccinated will get sick from that than unvaccinated. But that is only true when the majority of people in a population are vaccinated. So it only works in one specific situation. So let's say we have a population of 1,000 people. 990 are vaccinated and 10 are not vaccinated. So in our diagram here, the blue represent the vaccinated people and the red represent the unvaccinated people. We're going to introduce a virus into the community. So we have our little virus with little spike proteins. It's coming into the community and it's spreading through the community. Now, as that disease spreads, of the 990 vaccinated individuals, 20 of them get sick. Of the 10 unvaccinated individuals, 10 get sick. So from a sheer numbers perspective, just the absolute number of people who got sick in each subgroup, each subpart of the population, it is true that in this case, more vaccinated people got sick than not. However, this doesn't tell us a complete story. If you stop the story here, you're not telling the whole truth. If you look at the percents, you have an entirely different story. 2% of the vaccinated people got sick. 100% of the unvaccinated people got sick. And even if only 3 out of the 10 people who were unvaccinated got sick, that would still be more, at least from a percent perspective, than the vaccinated people. So keep in mind that just looking at something like this doesn't tell the full story. You need to look at things like percents to get a better understanding. It's also important to understand that even this idea that more people who are vaccinated get sick than unvaccinated is not always true. If you look at what's going on in the world right now, the people who have gotten vaccinated for COVID are getting sick at much, much fewer rates than people who are unvaccinated. The other kind of sub-misconception in our general misconception I up here is the idea that what's the point of getting a vaccine if you're still going to get sick? It's important to understand that, especially when there's a really high number of people getting sick from a disease, vaccines may not be able to provide full protection. However, most of the time, what they do is give you enough protection so that even if you do develop illness, it's very mild, especially compared to people who don't have that prior protection. And again, you guys are living through this in a real life scenario. The COVID vaccines may not prevent everybody from getting sick. Some people, even if they've been vaccinated, may develop symptomatic illness. But even in those cases, the illness is generally so much more mild that they don't need any types of medical interventions. So it's very rare for a vaccinated person to die of COVID as opposed to an unvaccinated person. It's much more likely that a person is going to develop a severe case of COVID if they have not had the vaccine than if they have had the vaccine. Another major misconception about diseases in general is that hygiene and better nutrition are responsible for reducing the number of diseases in our society, not things like vaccination. And yes, hygiene and nutrition certainly are important. You are never going to hear me say that you shouldn't wash your hands. You are never going to hear me say that we should not have a good sewage system and we should not have clean water. You're never going to hear me say, don't eat fruits and vegetables, unless of course you're allergic to them, in which case you shouldn't. These things are important, right? Hygiene and nutrition are important, and they can help reduce the risk of certain types of illnesses, especially things like foodborne illnesses. But we don't actually even vaccinate against foodborne illnesses very often, at least in our society. So this idea that hygiene and nutrition are going to protect us from everything is just a false narrative. Yes, they may help our bodies withstand disease a little bit better when we do get sick, but there are plenty of people who have very good nutrition and they have good hygiene and they get sick and they die. And honestly, some of the things that we can see are just sharp drop-offs in the number of diseases from year to year when we introduce a vaccine. So here's an example. The measles vaccine was introduced in 1963. And before 1963, there were about 300,000 to 800,000 measles cases per year. When we introduced the vaccine in 1963, by 1964, 1965, there were fewer than 100 measles cases in most years. There was also a 73% reduction in death rates. So the hygiene and nutrition between something like 1963 and 1964 and 1965 was not significantly different. The thing that was different was the introduction of that vaccine. Another example is with the chickenpox vaccine. Chickenpox rates were actually rising steadily until 1995 when the vaccine was introduced. And by the time we introduced that vaccine, within the next couple of years, 1996, 1997, the cases went from 4 million a year to 600,000 per year. Again, the hygiene and nutrition between 1995 and things like 96, 97, 98 were not significantly different. The thing that was different was the vaccine. It was the vaccine that helped reduce those case rates, not changing the nutrition or hygiene radically. Another misconception, and I'm sorry to start each one of these slides with the phrase another misconception, but that's what we're working with. So another misconception is the idea that natural immunity is better than vaccine-acquired immunity. And the kind of misunderstanding about this one is that to some people, they think that it's better to get a disease naturally because you'll produce better antibodies or more antibodies that will give you protection longer, rather than get a vaccine, which won't give you much protection at all. And in some cases, it is true that if you get a disease, you will produce more antibodies or maybe produce antibodies for longer than if you get a vaccine to that same disease. So that is, in some cases, partially true. But keep in mind that you have to survive that disease for that to even matter at all. So measles is a great example. Again, this is one that most of us haven't had. We may only know 1 or 2 people in our lives who have had measles. And here's something to understand about measles, is that the measles vaccine, once you've had the 3 shots in that series, will provide lifelong immunity to measles. Once you get those 3 vaccines, you're protected, as far as we know, for the whole rest of your life from that virus. And in terms of the vaccine complications, about 8 per every 1 million will have a serious reaction. And when I say a serious reaction to a vaccine, I mean something that requires hospitalization. If your arm gets sore or you feel tired after your vaccine, that is not a serious reaction. That is a good thing in a sense because it means that the vaccine is working. So a serious reaction to a vaccine is something that lands you in the hospital. Keep in mind that if you get measles naturally, 1 to 3 out of every 1,000 will die, and 3 in 10 will have serious complications, things that land them in the hospital and may affect them for the rest of their life. So it is true that if you get measles naturally, you may produce more antibodies to the virus. However, you have to survive that disease and not be one of these people that gets the really serious complications for that to even matter at all. And even then, when we look at long-term protection from measles, yes, people who got measles naturally may have more antibodies later in life, but people who got the vaccine are fine as well because the vaccine has still produced enough antibodies to protect them. Our last major misconception about vaccines is the idea that they cause autism. And this misconception came about as a result of a study that was published by someone named Andrew Wakefield in 1997. He published this study in The Lancet, which is actually a very well-respected medical journal. And in his study, he said that children who got the MMR vaccine develop autism. This set off a worldwide panic about vaccines, basically. Many parents stopped vaccinating their children against MMR, and it actually caused many scientists and many physicians and other healthcare providers to start looking at this idea that vaccines could cause autism. And literally, thousands upon thousands of studies have now been done to look at these initial claims, and not a single one has ever shown that there is a link between childhood vaccinations and autism. Later, this study that was published in 1997 was retracted. It turns out Andrew Wakefield made up about half of his data. So when he claimed that after getting the MMR vaccine, a few children in his practice developed autism, and you actually look at the data that he was using, it turns out about half of the children had already had symptoms of autism before they had the MMR vaccine. So literally half of his data was made up. The other half had such a small sample size that it wasn't ever found to be even remotely accurate. And since then, when I say thousands, I literally mean thousands of studies worldwide, in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, in places in Africa, in Australia, in New Zealand, literally everywhere in the world. People have been looking into this, and nobody has ever found any legitimate link between childhood vaccines and autism. So one fraudulent study set off an entire series of events, basically a chain reaction of events that have led to thousands and thousands of studies being done, and not a single one anywhere in the world has been able to ever show that there is any kind of link between vaccines and autism. Now, a related misconception to this, kind of a sub-misconception of this, is that, okay, it's not the vaccines, but it's the components of the vaccines that cause autism. And again, thousands and thousands of studies have been done, and not a single one of them has ever been able to link any of the components of the vaccine to autism. So some of the things that people claim cause autism are different types of what we call adjuvants and preservatives in vaccines. Adjuvants are substances that are added to vaccines to help increase the response to the vaccine. Basically, sometimes our vaccines need some additional help so that our body recognizes that as a foreign substance, and we actually will respond to it and create antibodies. One of the most common adjuvants is aluminum, and people get very concerned about that. One thing to understand is that the amount of aluminum in vaccines is smaller than even the amount of aluminum found in a standard over-the-counter dose of antacids. Not all antacids have aluminum in them, but some of them do. And when you look at the amount of aluminum that's in an antacid that you can buy over the counter and take basically as much as you want of, and a vaccine, the vaccine has far less. It's also, when aluminum is in a vaccine, it's eliminated from the body incredibly quickly. There was a study that was done looking at aluminum elimination after vaccines. And so they measured the amount of aluminum in vaccines. They gave those vaccines to infants, and they collected their fecal matter, basically their diapers, over the next week or so. It was found that the same amount of aluminum that was put into the infant's body was released by the infant's body in about 2 days. So within about 48 hours, the total amount of aluminum that went in then went back out. So it's not as if it lingers in the body very long. Another common concern is that the preservatives may have some chemicals in there that cause problems. Preservatives are used to prevent the vaccine from becoming contaminated with other bacteria or viruses and then making people sick as a result. And a common preservative is one called thimerosal or thimerosal. This is a mercury-based stabilizer and preservative, and people were very concerned about that mercury. One thing to understand is that the form of mercury that's found in thimerosal, which is that preservative, is different than toxic forms of mercury. And furthermore, all of the mercury has been removed from standard childhood vaccines. The only place we find any mercury in any childhood vaccines is in the annual influenza shot. So that can be used for adults as well. And keep in mind that even after the mercury was removed, the rate of autism continued to rise. So if the mercury had been causing autism, once it was removed, we shouldn't have seen any more cases of autism. If mercury were directly causing autism, then once mercury was removed, then we shouldn't have seen any more cases of autism. But we did, and we do, and in fact, the number of cases per year has been rising since we removed the mercury. So what we have seen here is that literally thousands of studies have been done, and millions, if not potentially billions of dollars have been poured into this area of research, and nobody, not in any country in the world, has been able to show that there's a link between vaccine or vaccine components and the development of autism. Not in any country, not any scientist, not any group has ever been able to show that there's any type of link. It was that one study in 1997 that turned out to be fraudulent. At least half of the data was made up, if not more, that had set off this chain of events, and it caused thousands and thousands of studies to be done, and not one of them has ever shown that there's any connection between vaccines and autism. I like to end this lecture with just a little bit about things you should consider when you are reading vaccine information online or anywhere really. Remember that vaccination is a medical procedure, and all medical procedures have risks. But keep in mind that there are risks to not getting medical procedures as well, right? Every time you go into a clinic or a hospital or even put a Band-Aid on, there is a risk of something going wrong. However, there's also a risk of something going wrong if you don't do those things. And most of the time, the risk of something going wrong is much higher if you don't use that medical intervention or medical procedure than if you do. Vaccines themselves are neither all good or all bad. Vaccines are overwhelmingly safe and effective and have done incredible things for the people, especially the children of this world, but there are always risks. Sometimes, very rarely, something will go wrong with vaccination. Again, keep in mind, vaccination is a medical procedure. There are always risks to medical procedures, and there are always risks to not getting a medical procedure done. So if you ever hear someone saying that vaccines are 100% good or 100% bad, they're probably not telling you the whole truth, and you should really consider whether that is someone that you want to trust with the information. Much of the vaccine misinformation and misconceptions come from a few sources. There was a study done recently that shows that the majority of pieces of vaccine misinformation or misconceptions that are posted on social media come from about 12 people in the United States. There are around 12 people who have managed to spread a bunch of misinformation throughout mostly social media and influence thousands, if not millions, of people. So keep in mind that even though you may be seeing a bunch of misinformation from various sources, when you boil it down and you start tracing things back, it comes down to about 12 people in the US who are spreading the majority of the misinformation. And many of those people are promoting alternatives or natural cures, or they have something that they are trying to sell. So they're trying to generate fear and make money off the fact that parents are concerned, right? Parents love their children and they want the best for them. And there is no parent in the world who wants their child to be sick. And so if you can generate this fear surrounding these vaccines and say, no, I have an alternative that's much, much safer, then many parents in the world who don't have the information that I've just given you all in this lecture are going to say, ooh, I want to go with what I think is safer. And so they make a decision based on what they know, trying to do the best for their child, even though the person who is selling them that cure or that technique or whatever it is may not have their best interests in mind. So it just boils down to this idea that all parents want their children to be safe. Every parent in the world wants to protect their child, and they're going to do whatever they can to do that. They may just be lacking the information to tell the difference between good information and not so good information. So when you are evaluating information you read about vaccines, these are all things to keep in mind, as well as keep in mind the information you know about the immune system, the information you know about chemistry and biology so far. Because so many of the misconceptions come about as a result of people simply not having the basic knowledge or basic information that they would need to be able to make a solid decision on that. They are making the best choice they can based on the information they have. And unfortunately, in some cases, the only information they have is generated by these individuals who are promoting misconceptions. And so if that's the only knowledge they have, that's the decision they're going to make. So every time you're evaluating information about vaccines, just keep all of this in mind. And you're always welcome to send me any questions that you have about them, whether you have them in a current semester or in a future semester or 10 years down the road. I'm always happy to talk about vaccines, help give you information about them, give you resources on them, and just talk.